Transferring seam lines from patterns to fabric is highly recommended if you don't quite have a handle on your sewing machine yet. The transferred lines will provide a helpful guideline, especially when sewing uneven curved seams. As you practice, you will naturally start to feel comfortable stitching seams without following an actual marked seam line on the fabric. For the first couple of projects, however, transfer all the seam lines from your patterns onto your fabric pieces until you are more accustomed to following your sewing machine's seam allowance guides. If your patterns do not have clearly marked seam lines, you can draw them directly on the pattern or the fabric pieces after the patterns have been cut and unpinned. Depending on your patterns, here are some seam line transfer techniques you can use. The tracing paper and tracing wheel method is used to transfer seam lines directly from your paper patterns onto the corresponding fabric pieces underneath. Some sewing patterns have seam allowance that is implied. For that reason, the seam lines are not directly marked on the paper patterns. If you want to use the tracing paper method, you will have to first hand draw the seam lines directly on the pattern yourself. Before the paper pattern is unpinned and separated from the fabric piece, place a sheet of tracing paper with its face side touching the wrong side of the fabric. If the pattern was cut on fold or two layers were cut together, use two sheets of tracing paper simultaneously, arranging each such that their right sides are touching each fabric layer's wrong side. Once the tracing paper is properly aligned, run your tracing wheel along the pattern seam lines. The tracing wheel perforations will leave a copy of the lines on the wrong side of each fabric layer. The gauge pointer and tailor's chalk technique can be a bit more time-consuming, but is perhaps the most universal method for marking seam lines on fabric. It is performed after the paper patterns are unpinned and separated. The seam lines are measured and marked directly on the fabric layer. To measure the seam allowance distance from the edge inward, you can use either a ruler or a gauge pointer, a tool designed specifically for this purpose. A gauge pointer is a tool marked with measurements on each side and featuring a slider in the middle. The slider can be positioned at any desired distance to denote the seam allowance width. The gauge pointer can then be aligned at the specified distance from the fabric edge to evenly measure and mark the seam allowance using a quilting pencil or tailor's chalk. To mark seam lines using a gauge pointer, follow these steps. Check what seam allowance is needed along each edge. In this example, we're working with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Next, align the gauge pointer such that the slider corresponds to the fabric cut edge and the end of the ruler portion is facing inwards, depicting the seam line. Using a tailor's chalk or a fabric quilting pencil, mark the seam line with a vertical dash line. Continue repositioning the gauge pointer along the fabric edge and marking with dash lines until the rest of the seam line is complete. If other edges have different seam allowance, adjust the slider to the correct width and repeat the steps to mark the seam lines. If you do not have a gauge pointer, you can use a ruler to measure and draw the location of the seam lines following the same logic described. Use the end of the ruler as a guide to mark each dash. Be careful measuring along curves. You will need to measure more densely and add smaller dashes along very curved edges. This seam line marking technique is the easiest, most universal, and compatible with almost all fabrics, whether highly textured or boldly printed. The quilting pencil will provide a more precise mark. Tailor's chalk, on the other hand, provides a thicker line suitable with highly textured fabrics like woolens and acrylics. The technique of notching fabric corners is used by intermediate to advanced dressmakers and may not be the best option for beginners. Notching fabric corners to mark seam allowance width is done when the pattern is still pinned to the fabric. It entails slashing the end of each seam line at each corner so that when the seams are aligned in the sewing process, the slits can be used as a guide for the location of the seam lines. This is a great technique to use if you already feel comfortable following the seam allowance guides on your sewing machine. To mark seam lines using the notching technique, slit the ends of all seam lines through the pattern and all fabric layers underneath. Once all corner seam lines have been notched, separate the paper pattern from the fabric. While you won't have clearly defined seam lines, a slit at the beginning and end of each seam line will facilitate aligning each seam with the correct seam allowance guide on your sewing machine. As always, tailor tags or hand basting are techniques used anytime the methods described today are not compatible with the fabric. This includes heavily decorated fabrics, high-pile fabrics, or textures that are difficult to directly mark on. In these situations, you can always count on hand-applied marking stitches. While they do take a longer time to apply, they provide a safe marking technique that is visible and easy to follow during the stitching process. In this case, the easiest and fastest approach to transferring seam lines is by using simplified Tailor Tags. They are stitched directly through the paper pattern and fabric layers underneath and very easy to remove when no longer needed. Here are some steps to marking seam lines using simplified tags. Using a double-threaded needle, insert a small stitch directly on top of the seam line through the paper pattern and fabric underneath. Next, insert another small stitch at about 1 or 2 inches away from the first, leaving a bit of slack in the long stitch. The distance between the small stitches will determine how close together the final tags are. For a more defined seam line, place the stitches closer together. Continue adding small basting stitches at 1 or 2 inches from one another directly on the seam line through the paper pattern and fabric layer underneath. When the entire seam line is completed, cut each long stitch right in the middle as shown. Carefully lift the pattern, separating it from the fabric underneath. The cut basting stitches will stay behind, forming the individual tailored tags. These tags will now provide a general shape of each seam line.